Thanks so much. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speakers for this event entitled German and U.S. Relations with Israel Amid Escalating Conflict in the Middle East. And it is sponsored by the American German Institute and the Department of Government here at Georgetown University. So we're really pleased to have Ambassador Christoph Heusgen, who's been chairman of the Munich Security Conference since 2022. He also teaches political science at the University of St. Gallen. He was the German permanent representative to the United Nations from 2017 to 2021, and the foreign policy advisor to Chancellor Angela Merkel from 2005 to 2017. And so maybe we'll get some insight into what's coming up in her memoir that will be published very soon. He graduated from the University of St. Gallen, studied at Georgia Southern College in the United States and at the Sorbonne in Paris. And I would be remiss if I also didn't note that he's a member of the American German Institute's Board of Trustees. We also have with us Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. From 1978 to 2003, he served at the State Department as a historian, analyst, negotiator, and advisor to both Republican and Democratic secretaries of state. He worked on U.S. policy with the Middle East and on the Arab-Israel peace process, including as senior advisor for Arab-Israeli negotiations. Outside of the government, he served as the president of Seeds of Peace, which empowers young leadership in regions of conflict. From 2006 to 2019, he was a public policy scholar and director of the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And he has 5 books, including The End of Greatness from 2014 and the Much Too Promised Land from 2008. And he got his PhD from the University of Michigan. And then our moderator today is Jeff Rathke, who's been the president of the American German Institute since 2018, after nearly a quarter century as a diplomat for the US Department of State, with postings in, God, this is a long list, Riga, Moscow, Dublin, Kuala Lumpur, Brussels, and Berlin. So without further ado, I'd like our panelists and moderator to take the stage.
We go. All right. I got the switch. It's a pleasure to be here and really an honor to be in partnership with the Georgetown University Department of Government. And thanks to all of you for being with us. Thanks also to those of us who are joining us by live stream. And we're really excited to present this discussion today. And we have 2 outstanding former officials, observers, and insightful commentators on U.S. German foreign policy, as well as the Middle East region. When we started planning this event, which was probably a couple of months ago, at that time, October 7th and the 1-year anniversary of the Hamas attack on Israel was our reference point. The attack on Israel, the Israeli response, the US and German diplomacy and relations with Israel and across the Middle East. Also, that included, at the time we were considering this, support for Israel's right to self-defense, as well as the efforts to press for a ceasefire and the release of hostages, and as well the alleviation of human suffering in Gaza. These were important considerations for both the United States and the German governments. Since then, of course, when we started preparing for this event, the conflict has widened greatly. The killing of Hezbollah leader Nasrallah in Beirut, the killing of Hamas leader Sinwar in Gaza, Hezbollah attacks on Israel from southern Lebanon, an Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon, and direct Iranian strikes on Israel for the 2nd time this year, as well as the Israeli response with attacks on military facilities in Iran. So this escalation of the conflict has enormous risks for the countries and populations of the region, but also naturally for the United States and for Germany. There are many issues that arise in connection with this sharpening crisis in the Middle East. In Germany and in the United States, there has been a dramatic rise in anti-Semitic incidents in recent years, and those have accelerated since October 2023. There is a similar rise in anti-Muslim incidents in both countries, which has been increasing for several years and has also accelerated over the past year. These are serious causes for concern, but they are not our main focus today. There are many other organizations, institutions, experts who work on those. We are looking today at German and U.S. relations with the Middle East. The U.S., of course, being the most important outside power in the region, but Germany also a very important player, to say nothing of the fact of the close relations the closest relations Israel has in Europe are with Germany. So with all of that as a backdrop, Aaron David Miller, I'd like to start with you and to hear your perspective on the explosive dynamics in the Middle East, the expansion of the conflict to bring in Hezbollah, to affect Lebanon and Iran directly. Is it inevitable that this war is going to, between Israel and Iranian proxies and Iran itself, is going to expand still further in geography, in time, in complexity?
First of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here with Christoph. When I left the State Department in January of '03, then Secretary of State, the late Secretary of State, Colin Powell, I'm sorry to say, gave me two pieces of advice. First piece of advice was don't ever try to come back. I took that piece of advice. I had 27 years. It was enough. They were unique years. Things might have happened during those years that didn't. But the second piece of advice he gave me, I acted wholeheartedly, which is don't try to look back. I've spent the last 20 plus years in the public conversation trying to sort through what America got right and what it didn't. But the one cautionary tale that informs everything that I do and say these days is the critical importance of looking at the world the way it is, not just the way you want it to be. If you only look at the world the way it is, nothing ever changes. But if you insist on tethering your policy, your attitudes, your obligations to the world the way you want it to be, I guarantee you're going to fail. It is the balance between the two that usually results in effective or successful policies. I'm going to make 7 observations about the last year, try to encompass both the headlines and the trend lines. Number one, and perhaps the most important observation at all for external parties to this conflict. The last year has demonstrated with a terrifying clarity the minimal influence that external parties can have on a conflict in which the 2 or 3 or 4 major ends believe the stakes are existential politically, security point of view, or whether the organizations they run are somehow imperiled by making certain choices. The people in this neighborhood will do more, care more, and willing to risk than the United States or any external actor. And it is tragic and sad that the trajectory of the last year has been set by and large by 2 decision makers, the late Yahya Sinwar and the preeminent Israeli decision maker, Benjamin Netanyahu. More on that in a minute. Middle East is littered, literally, with the remains of great powers who wrongly believe they could impose their will on smaller ones. We need to be extremely sober and humble in our assessment. Number 2, the last year also reflects the limitations on the 4 leaders, 4, who have largely been responsible for the way this conflict has played out. Yahya Sinwar, Hassan Nasrallah, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei of Iran. They would not be my 4 candidates for entrusting this piece of the Middle East with vision, with a need or effort to reduce conflict. On the contrary, I think it's quite clear their policies have been driven by ideology, by the influence of domestic politics, and in the case of the two heads of non-state actors, Hamas and Hezbollah, by what I would describe to you as the organizational imperative. Number three, the reason we do not have an Israeli-Hamas ceasefire agreement over the course of the last year, there are many reasons, but the one reason is because the missing ingredient that determines whether or not any negotiation succeeds. I've been around my fair share of largely failed negotiations, but some successes. It's the absence of urgency. Urgency. The incentives of reaching the agreement need to outweigh the disincentives or the incentives of not including one. And frankly, in the worldviews of Netanyahu and Sinwar, or whoever the still nameless leader of Hamas will be, Sinwar's brother, an external leader, Khalil al-Hayya, who knows? But it may not matter. It's urgency. And there's been insufficient urgency on the two major combatants. Fourth, clearly, limitations of military dominance and power has been demonstrated, in my judgment. Yes, the power of Israel's military campaigns in all three arenas, Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran, has been demonstrated with a tactical brilliance and operational capacity. But military power untethered from sustainable political objectives becomes an end in itself without much direction. And this, I fear, is the problem. The challenge will be to see whether or not this escalation dominance can be converted. And let me be very clear here. We're not talking about conversion into transformative agreements that are going to fundamentally reshape the modern Middle East. That's not what we're talking about. I see very few end states here. We're talking about transactional agreements, understandings, limited accords, driven by containment, and deterrence. If you could get that and minimize conflict, you might, with the proper leadership, begin to exploit that period of quiet and perhaps do more. 5, the Israeli-Iranian conflict has entered a new phase. It is stunning to me that since April, both Israel and Iran have struck one another directly and openly twice. My takeaway from this is that risk tolerance, particularly on the part of the Israelis, but not only on the part of the Israelis, risk tolerance has increased, not diminished. Both have now managed to strike one another repeatedly without a major escalation leading to a multi-front war, which is something the Middle East in its iteration has never experienced before. This is I'm not suggesting it's the new normal, but it doesn't bode well for the future. 6, the Palestinian issue may well have been reestablished at the top of the regional and international agenda in any number of ways, but it has nowhere to go. And I fear, because I occupy a tiny space on the planet for a very short period of time. I do not say never. I hear people say there'll never be a conflict-ending solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm sorry, it's morally unacceptable. We can't see what's in front of us. None of us, not even Pythia, the Oracle of Delphi, reading the best of Godin trails, can figure out a way to predict what's going to happen. But for the foreseeable future, we're going to be stuck between a two-state solution that is probably still too important to abandon, but on the other hand, almost impossible under these circumstances to implement. 7, the humanitarian situation in and around this conflict has been nothing short of catastrophic. For Israelis, primarily given the asymmetry of power for Palestinians. And I'll say this, I don't know how many times I have to say it. The vaunted international community, a year in, remains weak, divided, self-interested, otherwise preoccupied, without the requisite power or capacity to do much about it. And the major combatants, the government of Israel, the most extreme right-wing government in Israel's history, and Yahya Sinwar and the leadership of Hamas, frankly, exhibited willful disregard, to say the least. And here is where urgency is critically important. I mean, the urgency for Palestinians in Gaza, the urgency for Lebanese affected by Israeli military operations, the urgency for hostages, 97, according to the Israelis, that remain, 40 to 50 are no longer alive by their estimates. That's where the urgency is. But we lack the leadership necessary to make this particular situation much better. I just close with one point. I didn't mention the Biden administration, and I did it willfully. We can talk about it. It deserves a bit of time. But the broader problem for the United States in this region, to me, is very, very clear. We face a conundrum which has not been resolved. We cannot transform this region. Iraq and Afghanistan should have proven that, but we cannot extricate ourselves from it. So the real question, and no administration that I worked for, with one exception, has found the balance between transformation and extrication. But that is the challenge for the next administration. Hopefully 6 days from now, and not much longer, we'll know who the next president is going to be. I've gone on longer than I intended, and I apologize.
Well, that is terrific, and thank you, Aaron. And I think you've left us a hook as well to come back a bit more to the opportunities, the challenges for American and international diplomacy when we get to discussion. But now I want to turn to Christoph Heusgen. Christoph, Germany's commitment to Israel's security has been defined by your former boss, Chancellor Merkel, and also the current Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, as a part of Germany's raison d'etat, Staatsräson. In other words, it is an interest above party politics and the government of the day. At the same time, Germany's tense relations with Iran have suffered another stress point this week with the execution of a German-Iranian dual national. Sorry. So I'd like to hear your views on how Berlin sees the situation in the Middle East, but perhaps also if you can pick up on the point that Aaron just made about this conundrum, which I think applies to Germany in a similar way, that Germany cannot transform the Middle East. It also can't extricate itself, even if its obligations are slightly different from those of the United States. That conundrum, how do you see that?
I think you take the switch on the side.
Yes, wonderful. Thanks, Jeff, for inviting me here. It's wonderful to be at Georgetown and be with the American German Institute. And thanks very much, Aaron, for framing the issue. And I think you hit, you mentioned the most important points, and which doesn't leave us for a solution, but at least it's very, very well framed. Now, this is a very, I see some familiar faces, a very German audience, or German with knowledge about Germany. Nevertheless, to explain the German position, one has to go back to the Holocaust. And the German commitment to Israel goes back to the Holocaust, goes back to the fact that 6 million Jews were victims of the Holocaust, and this has led all German governments also to commitment to Israel by, say, paying reparations, by doing a lot of payments until today for Holocaust survivor, by supporting, I come to that, Israel also in military terms. And for me, it was significant. A couple of weeks ago, President Biden paid a last visit in his capacity as president to Berlin and met with the president, and the president had invited Margot Friedländer, a Holocaust survivor who was in the front row, and this kind of symbolized this commitment, also something that links also the US and Germany. This is a support to Israel and to the Jews. Now, the two of us, Jeff, we met, I think, at the end of 2005 when you were at the US Embassy in Berlin, and I became then the foreign policy advisor to Chancellor Merkel, and been that for 12 years. And I witnessed all her foreign policy, and as an advisor, give some advice. But on this point, she was very, very strong. And I think I have not looked into, nobody has, or very few people have looked into the book that is going to appear also in I don't know, a bunch of languages at the end of the month. And I think her relationship with Israel will have a prominent place in that book. I bet on that. It has to do with the fact that she was she grew up in East Germany, and in East Germany, in the GDR, they never recognized Israel. The DDR did. They always said, well, the fascists, those responsible for the Holocaust, were the Nazis, and the West Germans were inherited this, and we, the East Germans, we are the good guys. So I think the chancellor was really, was really hit by the Holocaust, the dimension, also what the German responsibility for this when, she became minister and then became chancellor. For her, the commitment to Israel was key. I was with her at all the visits during her 12 years, and at the time, you may remember, was Prime Minister Olmert. They developed a very good relationship, and we started to have intergovernmental consultations, real close relations, even a friendship, which led, and I see Amal here, the former Lebanese ambassador to the UN, that led also in 2006 for Olmert giving Chancellor Merkel a very important role. Now, this may be a detail, but you remember the Israeli war against Hezbollah against Lebanon in 2006, when Beirut, the airport, was closed, and Olmert at the time tasked Germany, our interior minister, to send some experts to the airport in Beirut to make sure that the controlled security was okay. And then when we said it was okay, Olmert allowed for, at the time, the airport to become open. And Olmert, this was something very special, asked us then also for Germany to be part of UNIFIL. And we, in 2006, then sent a frigate and have been participating in the maritime dimension of UNIFIL since 2006. And we thought that was something very special, that an Israeli prime minister asked the German chancellor to participate in a operation whose mandate is very weak, but nevertheless was there also to somehow guarantee that no weapons flow into, and somehow give Israeli security to a certain degree in German hands. So that was very very important at the time. And then she gave in 2008 the famous speech at the Knesset, where she called the security of Israel the raison d'etat in Germany and for Germany. And she has followed up by delivering what we believe are maybe among the best submarines in the world, frigates that we send in the UN. We regularly abstain in the General Assembly, also against the majority of EU countries, just to support Israel. And then, I don't want to be too long, came the 7th of October. And again, the German government, the German political scene gave its full solidarity to Israel, also in view of these horrendous attacks on Israelis. And we, until today, continue to send weapons. We had a debate last week in the parliament where the chancellor made it very clear we will continue to send weapons. We support Israel. Also, the government supported Israel. Also, in the case in front of when South Africa put the case of genocide to the International Court of Justice. Germany supported the Israeli position, and this is not something where only the chancellor, his party, but also the opposition, the head of the opposition, Friedrich Merz, they're all on the same line. You'll find that the leading German tabloid from the Springer house also is fully in support of Israel. So you have this as the official position of the government in parliament, in the media. When you look at the polls, it is not quite the same. You do have, and it changed over time from a full support for Israel after 7th of October. There is now a majority of Germans who are critical about Israel because of the suffering of tens of thousands of people in Palestine and in Lebanon. So there is a certain disconnect. Of course, a lot has to do also with the fact that we have a lot of immigrants that are from Arab countries or are have their Islamic faith. So there are a lot of internal discussions as well, but the government position as it is. Two more points when it comes to the criticism. One of the criticisms is the interpretation of raison d'etat. There is the definition that whatever the Israeli government does, no matter what, is it in violation of international law, international humanitarian law, you support it. You continue to send weapons, etc. You support even if the International Court of Justice says there is a danger of genocide, you continue to say there is we stick with Israel. A former Israeli ambassador to Germany with whom I negotiated also submarines and who was also an Israeli in the peace process. You may have run across him, Yoram Ben-Zeev, an Israeli ambassador and chief of staff of President Peres. So he's no longer a teen. He said that for him, raison d'etat also has something to do when you have to look at what is in the long range, in the long term, in the interest of Israeli security. Is it in Israelis security interest to what he said, violate international law, to continue to have the settlements, to make it impossible that there is a two-state solution, to see can Israel have peace when there are millions and millions of Palestinians living in townships or whatever. Is this in the long interest, or is it raison d'etat for Germany, who has a certain influence? At least Merkel had a lot of some influence, not that much on Netanyahu, but still some influence. Would it be then also for a friend to say, listen, this is where the buck stops. You go too far, you have to do it. It's not in your security interest. And then there is a second point, which is a point that is very dear to my heart, because this is something which goes to the basis of our country, and this is the rule of law. We have in Germany, with our constitution, one of the best constitutions that they are. They brought this constitution brought the longest period of democracy, of rule of law, functioning state to my country. And more importantly, the rule of law is what brought Europe the longest period of peace on that the European continent has lived in its entire history. And this is why people like Adenauer and de Gaulle and de Gasperi and Robert Schuman said, we no longer want to fight out our difference on the battlefield, but we go to the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. We go to Brussels, to the Council, and try to solve our problems in the peaceful way. And as I said, this is the longest period of peace that the center of Europe has had in its history. And this is what was basically the idea behind founding the United Nations. Was the same idea after the League of Nations failed. The idea of the United Nations, of the Charter of the United Nations, was to prevent catastrophes as we encountered in the Second World War. And this is why the Charter of the United Nations is, from my perspective, so important. International law is so important. International humanitarian law is very important, and we have to do everything to defend this. I was ambassador to New York, and together with Amal, and I've been just in New York again. The atmosphere in New York is horrible because people are afraid that the charter is no longer in the basis, that people attack each other of double standards left and right. There is a call by some of the P5 for a new order, which will be a totally different one of what we have had in the past. So therefore, I think that, and this is where I criticize also the German position from somebody who's no longer part of it. I think we have to orient our policy also according to international law. When the International Court of Justice says there is the danger of genocide, including from a very respected German judge, where they say certain measures have to be taken, and these measures are not taken. I think that there is a need for our government to make it much clearer how far we can go. If you go right now in the situation of northern Gaza, when you listen to what Israeli members of government say, the plan of the generals, when they see how this implemented, these are war crimes that are committed, and I think one has to speak out against that. If we don't do that, you hear it first of all for people also, as I said, this is raison d'etat for Israel, but also we will see that the whole international order will go down the drain, and instead of the rule of law, we'll have soon the law of the strongest governing. So therefore, I think one needs to take also the position of international law when looking at the conflict, with all the problems that is, but nobody so far has explained a better order than the one we have.
Thank you, Christoph. I want to pick up on what you've just said and also where you left off, Aaron, because you talked about the difficulties for the United States, manifold, but one of them was the two-state solution, an idea that can't be abandoned and also can't be realized in the current environment. With looking at the next U.S. administration, you talked about the difficulties of, first of all, the limits of outside powers influencing developments on the ground, and also the challenge of setting consequences and drawing lines. How do you, are those two things contradictory? Acknowledging the inability of the United States or other outside powers to influence things, while at the same time wanting to see them develop differently. I
mean, I don't have to remind anyone here that U.S. policy is filled with any number of anomalies, hypocrisies, contradictions. Here, I would offer three quick data points by way of perspective. Number one, the last American president to seriously threaten consequences, seriously threatened consequences. I didn't work for. That president was Dwight D. Eisenhower, who threatened Israel with sanctions if Ben-Gurion did not withdraw Israeli forces from Sinai. And Ben-Gurion complied, because Ben-Gurion understood that when Israelis wage war, they need three things. They need the support of a great power, they need the war to be quick and over, and they need to maintain what Ben-Gurion described as the, quote, moral high ground. That was the last American president. The first, whether it's the last to actually threaten to impose and then follow through, unclear. I've worked for administrations from Ronald Reagan to Bush 43. Among those presidents, only one, George H.W. Bush, and I happen to work for James Baker, decided on the way to Madrid, which is ancient history now, October 1991, that they would deny the then Shamir government $10 billion of housing loan guarantees. This was not $10 billion in cash. This was the administration being willing to vouch for the Israelis to borrow at commercial banks at a lower interest rate, primarily for the absorption of Russian Jews. Reagan delayed several times advanced fighter aircraft to Israel. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, in the context of 1973 war, and then later Ford and Kissinger threatened a reassessment in order to edge Rabin to accept the second Sinai disengagement agreement. But just let's be clear here. Serious and sustained pressure on the state of Israel is the exception, not the rule, in terms of American policy. And I would just offer one comment on the Biden administration. It's the most frequently asked question I get, hundreds of interviews since October 7. Why has the United States refused, been reluctant to impose a single cost or consequence on the policies of the most extreme right-wing government in the history of the state of Israel that normal humans, I consider myself relatively normal, would agree constitutes sustained and serious pressure? And the answer that I give is just people don't accept it. It's not emotionally satisfying. It may not be morally correct, but it is the answer. Three reasons. And anyone here who does not believe, who believes that American foreign policy is forged in a sort of hermetically sealed bell jar based on what constitutes the material objective interests of the United States does not understand U.S. foreign policy. The sensibility that a president brings to the office is critically important to how policy is conceived and made. That's obviously an asterisk with respect going forward. Congress goes in and out of session. Supreme Court goes in and out of session. The president is 24/7. It was beyond Joe Biden's emotional and political bandwidth to consider imposing serious costs or consequences, primarily conditioning or restricting U.S. military assistance to Israel, particularly given the fact that Israel was not in conflict with Egypt or Syria or even the Palestinian Authority. Israel's in conflict with Hamas, the organizational embodiment of an idea, according to the president, which is the replacement of Israel with an Islamic State, and Hezbollah. So that's the first reason, the president's bandwidth. Second is the politics. And while it may cost Kamala Harris, arguably in a close election, 100,000 votes, number of seats in the University of Michigan football stadium, it may cost, as any issue would cost, in an election which is right now a coin toss. President did not veer toward the uncommitted and the progressive and left of center wing of the Democratic Party. He veered toward the Republican Party, which has set itself up as the Israel can do no wrong party. And the third reason was the policy. The minute we tethered our policy to an Israeli-Hamas ceasefire, which was in fact the policy, the only hope of de-escalating the war and freeing hostages, the minute we tethered ourselves to that approach and that negotiation, it was like the spider saying to the fly, "Come into my web." because success depended on the calculations of two preeminent decision makers, Yahya Sinwar, which had saw no urgency in cutting this deal, and Benjamin Netanyahu, whose political survival depended on a level of controlled, I would call it controlled escalation. Persona, politics, and policy, in my view, is why we are where we are with respect to American pressure. And frankly, I don't see much change, at least initially, going forward, regardless of whether Kamala Harris becomes the next president or the previous president does a Grover Cleveland and becomes president again.
Christoph, the question that Aaron raised about, as you put it, the phrase was costs and consequences. You know, there has been an allegation circulating in German politics that while the government has not denied any requests by Israel for rearmament, for example, there has been an effort to discourage those requests from being lodged in the first place. Now, whether that is true and so forth is not the most important thing, but I think when we come to this question of, it's clear that the German government has placed an emphasis on on ameliorating the humanitarian situation. But when it comes to the topic of costs and consequences, what, in your view, is available to a German government, and would it have the desired effect?
I don't think that to start with the second part of your question, German decisions don't matter. I mean, Netanyahu is not influenced by President Biden asking him, to agree to a ceasefire of whatever weeks. He's right now again proposal on Lebanon or others, but Netanyahu doesn't listen. So let alone Germany or Europeans. Actually, when you have Israelis, counterparts, this government, they kind of ridicule Europe and the European road. So there is no influence there. The major weapon deliveries are basically finished or will continue, which are the submarines and frigates. I'm no longer in government. I don't know where we stand. I only know what is in the media, and there is that they are some requests for weapons, and some are met, or some dual use are met. Some others are not right now honored or waiting out. But this is not really significant. Significant, of course, would be a decision by the government to say, as other countries have done in Europe, to say, okay, now we see the degree of violation of international law, and therefore we stop the delivery of weapons. There are some in parliament who would do that, but the chancellor was very clear, and also the head of the opposition was very clear, no way we will continue to do that. So that's a political message that doesn't have any influence. It just speaks for the policy that is being conducted.
Okay, thanks. And to take a step back and look at the broader region, because of course, I think one has to account for the Iranian role, and you've spoken to it with Khamenei being one of the four key decision makers, as you put it, Aaron. But are we focusing too much on Israel here? Shouldn't we be talking about Iran? Because the attacks on October 7th, it appears the Iranian leadership was aware of them, wouldn't have happened without their assent, acquiescence. Just in the same way, the attacks by Hezbollah from southern Lebanon on Israel. So is this the wrong frame?
It's the Iranian piece and the Iranian domestic piece and Iran's ambitions in the region is an important part of the frame. I just, I've watched this now for a couple decades. I won't speak for the Israelis, but the U.S. has a strategic problem with the Islamic Republic. but we do not have a strategic solution. That is the conundrum that we face. That's why everything that we do with the Iranians is what I call transactional. You conclude a nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, 2015. It was, in my judgment, it was a flawed but highly functional accord. Germans were involved in this. It delayed, restrained, restricted significantly, and it was very well monitored. But it was transactional. There may have been an Obama administration official or two who believed this could somehow pave the way to a transformative relationship between Iran and the U.S. I mean, the U.S. and Israel are agents of mobilization and legitimization that the Iranian IRGC and the Ayatollah uses in order to justify and rationalize Iran's policies. But we don't have a strategic solution, and we really don't know what to do. Now, when I say that the Israelis have now crossed a line, and so have the Iranians, I really believe that this is unbelievably significant. The Israelis have now clearly begun to convince themselves that they pulled this off, striking, as I mentioned to Christoph, an Israeli official said, the Iranians are playing soccer now without a goalie. That the visual image of that, to me, is stunning. The Iranians are playing soccer with us without a goalie. So the Israelis stripped their air defenses, the S-300s. We don't know whether or not the Russians are seriously considering delivering the upgraded system. They destroyed key aspects of the ballistic missile program. And they basically sent a message that we have no goalie. We can score on you whenever we want. And this fact that it was done with the support and in very close coordination with the United States, with no loss of pilots, civilian casualties unclear, has opened, in my judgment, the risk tolerance for the possibility now of dealing with the nuclear issue. Yes, stayed away from nuclear sites and economic infrastructure. But if the Iranians should respond the next time with a ballistic missile strike as they did October 1, I think the Israeli target set is going to expand. And having worked for Republicans and Democrats and voted for Republican Democrats, what I'm about to say should not come as a shock. Benjamin Netanyahu likely is going to remain the prime minister of Israel. Certainly, government comes to term in 2026. There are a couple issues in the coalition that could threaten his coalition, but it's very hard for me to see for most of 2025. Should Donald Trump become president? It's unclear to me whether his risk aversion that he demonstrated during the first term, you'll remember September 2019, Iranians using drones and crews struck two critically important oil producing facilities in Saudi Arabia. Trump administration did nothing. On the diplomatic side, they withdrew from the JCPOA. On the military side, it was a very weak, no response. I wouldn't rule out that the sun and the moon are aligning here. And I would stress to you again, the confidence factor that the Israelis now, I think, legitimately now have concluded. They've done something no one thought they could ever do at the risk of a major war and a major escalation. It hasn't happened. And that expands the risk tolerance, less so on the Iranian side, to them as well. So I would be insulting everyone's collective intelligence if I said to you, I have an RX, a prescription for how to deal with Iran. I mean, a new regime, sure, yeah, that's what you need. You need a regime that doesn't have the acquisitive interest in requiring a nuclear weapon, but it's too late for that. Had the Shah remained in power, I guarantee you, Iran would have weaponized, just like the Israelis have weaponized.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to turn to our audience now and give you the opportunity to ask questions and participate in the conversation. So if you would like to be recognized, please put your hand up. We have mics roving. And if you could give us your name and affiliation, and pose your question in the form of a question, that would be terrific. I see Alex here in the front. Yeah. Yeah, that's, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Alex Prioritea, with also with AGI. Question, I mean, given what you have said, both of you, which I personally found very depressing, what kind of scenarios can you imagine in which leverage starts appearing from outside actors? Or are we just waiting for events to unfold? And if I'm allowed a second part, a second part of the question is, given all that you said about the dynamics with regards to Iran not having a goalie and playing soccer, European football, in a sort of slightly sort of weakened position, isn't this going to accelerate on the part of Iran the wish to develop nuclear capabilities to inoculate itself in the future, perhaps like North Korea, from what is happening at the moment? Thank you.
Give each of you the opportunity to respond if you'd like.
Well, on the first question, I think you hinted to that. The only solution, also my Israeli friends tell me, the only way how Netanyahu can be stopped by the US deciding not to provide weapons anymore. The Israelis have stocks probably for a certain period, but they need the constant delivery of US weapons. They don't produce also for the Iron Dome and everything. They're dependent on this. Is this likely? I mean, there was, didn't President Biden say, I give you so and so many days, and if you don't deliver, then we stop weapons, which was after election day. But this is the only way. I don't know. Biden is, you described it very well. I cannot repeat what you said, but emotionally, rationally, he is 100% pro-Israel. Biden is. But Kamala Harris, I'm not that sure. And I wouldn't underestimate maybe then when you see the repercussions in the region, when you see also the humanitarian catastrophe that is, but also when you see how the support of Israel costs the US, costs my country, Germany, a lot of goodwill around the globe. You cannot imagine how now the Russians and Chinese run around at the UN saying here double standards from morning to night, and you see how votes become more and more difficult. So I think at some stage with somebody like Kamala Harris, I could imagine that something happens. With Trump, the UN, they are now making plans how to maintain the organization without US contributions to it. So there are these two things. What was the second question was? Oh yeah, the Iranian. Of course, I mean, this is the JCPOA. We agree on this. It was at the time a chance to stop it, and it actually was verified. The Iranians did destroy a lot of centrifuges and exported enriched uranium. So it was not a solution to the problem, but it helped some. Of course, the only thing, the population is against this, against the government, certainly. They want to keep in power, and they see now how vulnerable they are. They play, I've never seen a team win a soccer match without a goalkeeper. So they see how vulnerable they are. And the only life insurance is the nuclear weapon. And if the Iranians get the nuclear weapon, that was the idea behind the JCPOA. If the Iranians have it, it will not take long, and the Turks will have it, the Saudis will have it, and the world will not become safer.
I just offer 2 quick points on the letter that Christoph referred to. It was sent from the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State to the Israeli Minister of Defense, and the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs. It's a long letter. It itemizes what the administration would like the Israelis to do. There's a very strong concluding paragraph on what they should not do with respect to UNRWA, which they've gone ahead and begun the process of doing that. It's interesting, though. The letter is dated October 13th. It's 30 days. I've been through transitions from R's to D's, D's to D's, D's to R's. And it is not inconceivable. I hate double negatives, but it's not inconceivable that if Harris wins, that the Biden administration, in its 3 months remaining, the Biden administration, not the Harris administration, only have one president at a time, might, if the Israelis fail to comply with a lot of what's in that letter, I could imagine it, then kicking in what the letter says, may have implications for the delivery of U.S. military assistance. To relieve her of the burden of doing this. Now, whether she would agree with that and wants to confront on the other side an even angrier Israeli prime minister and Republican, who knows, if the Republicans take the Senate and the House, it's going to be very hard for her. So, but again, I wouldn't rule it out. On the nuclear issue, my colleague at Carnegie, Karim Sedgwick-Poor, who really, if you read no one else on this, he's the person to read. He says the most revolutionary of regimes the day after a revolution becomes incredibly conservative. And what are they conserving? They're conserving the revolution. The Ayatollah Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, I think, is very wary of pushing toward weaponization. Number one, it's going to give the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Most Iranian analysts I know believe that the so-called malacracy is going to give way to military dictatorship, with the IRGC playing the critical role. Once the decision is made to weaponize, well, you can imagine the consequences. The IRGC becomes the controlling force in Iranian politics. And Khamenei may not want that. Second issue is whether or not, if detected by the 5 American presidents have basically publicly said Iran will not acquire a nuclear weapon, which raises the question not just of an Israeli strike, but of an American strike. And all the Israelis can do is set back the program. The United States can do a lot more. I still believe that the Iranians will not try to break through. And by the way, it's a week to produce, even according to the IAEA, it's a week to produce enough fissile material, enriched uranium, for multiple devices. And it's within 6 months, I've seen analysis that the Iranians could miniaturize the warhead, create a physics package, and a delivery. You could have an Iranian deliverable nuclear weapon by mid next year. If the Iranians made this decision to weaponize, would we know it? That's an interesting question.
Okay, thanks very much. I see one hand all the way in the back, and then we'll come forward.
Hello, my name is Anna. I'm an undergrad studying STIA in the School of Foreign Service. I was wondering if do you think if U.S. military aid to Israel was not conditioned to be spent at U.S. firms and therefore have somewhat of a multiplier effect, revenue to U.S. firms and jobs for U.S. firms, like manufacturing jobs, we would be more likely to impose costs on aid and condition aid when it comes to humanitarian aid into Gaza and everything?
Thanks. Let's take a second question, then when we'll have a response here on the aisle. Go ahead.
Yeah, Werner Graf from Howard University. I'm just a simple-minded brain surgeon, so, but I'm a scientist and scientific method. I think looking at this, it's the position and the saying of Staatsräson for the dealing with Israel. You cannot only lead to a certain schizophrenia in policies. Of course, Germany has the Shoah in the background, and I think there is a very romantic attachment to Israel, which goes back to the time of Ben Gurion, Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan, Yitzhak Rabin, and I think the perception of the Israeli government is a wishful thinking and should be, they wished it would be like that in the old days. But as it was said here, the Netanyahu government with his right-wingers and basically racists, what they have, it's not the government. And I think when you say, okay, they are friends, but at one point you have to tell your friends, you have to stop this for your own good. So I don't know how you can resolve this conundrum, but in the view of what's happening in Gaza and now in Lebanon, which looks like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I mean, Israel is responsible for all this. And recently, I mean, Dr. Heusgen will know it, a lunch show, there was Professor Ambos, he said Israel is basically functionally occupying, it's a functional occupation of Gaza, and they have to be responsible for what's going on there. And I think you cannot condone that Gallant comes out and says, we want revenge, we don't give electricity, no food, no water, no nothing. I think this has the signature of genocidal action. And how would you deal with this schizophrenia of the German policy you find yourself now?
Okay, thank you. First question about U.S. weapons.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very effective talking point, particularly for Republican Party, many of whom don't see the need or the centrality of this very robust U.S. support for Israel, at least the isolationist wing of the Republican Party, J.D. Vance in particular, for example. But I think you'd still end up, even if most of the contracts weren't going to American military and tech firms, that's part of the argument. But the overwhelming argument is the political argument, and well, less so these days, the value affinity argument, that it's in the broadest conception of the American national interest to support like-minded societies abroad. And despite the preferential nature of the Israeli democracy, I mean, Israel is in many respects the way we were in this before the civil rights legislation. It's now a preferential democracy. 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel suffer from significant social and economic discrimination. And there's no public square in Israel. I mean, you're not going to get 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel to sing the Israeli national anthem. My own view is that over time, we need to find another replacement. Israel is an extremely wealthy country. I think military aid creates a huge problem for both the Israelis and for the United States. And I would argue over time, in an environment that is less confrontational, it ought to be phased out. We can continue to cooperate with the Israelis, position military equipment there, do R&D, but we don't need to be giving them $10 billion. 3.8 for 10 years, which is what the Obama administration had agreed to. I think it would be healthier, frankly, for both countries.
Christoph, the question of responsibility in Gaza and so forth.
Yes, to the brain surgeon, I think that you have a very good grasp of how Germany feels. There is this nostalgia, there is this wishful thinking for an Israeli government that is like Ben Gurion and Adenauer and I would say even Olmert and Merkel, and this is no longer the case. It took a while also for the German public to understand that this government is different, that you have somebody like Mr. Ben-Gvir who was among the group that was responsible for the murder of Rabin. Or you have somebody like Smotrich, who doesn't recognize the right of existence of Palestinians. And these are part of the government who have now, these ministers and others, half of Likud were there, meeting 2 weeks ago, where they said, now we have to resettle Gaza. You know, it sinks gradually. I said about the pulse in now the German public opinion, but the government has not changed its position there. You see the Greens becoming more and more critical, but at the same time not questioning the basic decision. The chancellor until now has not even questioned that Israel adheres to international law, while the American president has accused Netanyahu of war crimes by saying that there is indiscriminate bombing. German chancellor, German head of the opposition has not done that. So there is this kind of disconnect. I think it will still take some time until this aspect will be, you know, is this still something that the government can continue the way it does, or should they assume also a position like the US government has?
We have 1 minute left. Christian, can you ask a very quick question?
I try to ask two very quick questions. No, thank you. Thank you. Alan, a couple of days before the elections, does this crisis have an impact on the election outcome and the Biden-Harris crisis management? And the second one, Christoph, to you, you said this, Germany's rule of law, Israel's long-term security interests. How do you balance this, like, I would say, legitimate criticism of Israeli policy with what you said, Jeff, rising anti-Semitism?
Look, on the election, we're not going to know until it's over. But I would say, if you have a coin in your pocket, take it out. One side will be Harris, the other side will be Trump. Flip it up in the air, and you tell me where it lands.
But does it land differently because of the—
I mean, you've got voters in Michigan, you've got Arab Americans, Muslim Americans that will not, under any circumstances, vote for Kamala Harris. It doesn't matter whether her words were somewhat more empathetic, that she feels and can convey that feeling in a way that Joe Biden, who's a good man, cannot convey that sort of feeling that he has for the Israelis. Can't seem to summon up the same for the horrific losses on the Palestinian side. I just think, yeah, in this kind of election, an issue, a remark, a reference to the former president or he wants the generals that Adolf Hitler had. Anything can turn this election. And yes, Gaza could very well. If she loses Michigan, she needs Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Needs to win them all. If she loses Michigan, there's still another route for her in the Electoral College. But, you know, I was in Ann Arbor, Dearborn. I know how angry people are. And it could be enough.
Christoph.
Just following, I was in New York last weekend when Trump said something about Puerto Rico. I think that also plays in the election. I think it's a toss-up there, what comes up in the last moments. I think you made a very important point, and I should have done it earlier. I think we have to distinguish much more, and our politicians have to do that, between anti-Semitism and being critical about the government in Israel. This is mixed. And we have to distinguish that. You know, anti-Semitism is something horrible. You know, and I'm very proud in Germany we have now. I live in Berlin in a former Jewish quarters. You go out of your house and you see the cobblestones there, the stones where they remember the people who lived in the house where they were killed. Or I've been proposing for a long time, for years already, you know, that as part of education, not only for immigrants, but for Germans as well, there has to be the Holocaust on the curriculum. You have to have whoever has gone to a concentration camp, everybody is influenced by that. So I think it has to be on the agenda of all schools to go to concentration camps, and so that I hated to see how Jewish or Israeli houses or synagogues or whatever, Leo Beck centers, or they are protected by police. That you cannot have a Jewish life. At the same time, when there are Arabs protesting or having the Palestinian flag, and when you see how these are taken as being anti-Semitic, when they protest what Israel does, they are seen anti-Israel, anti-Semitic. Is put in the same mixture. There is some reason to it, because with some of the immigrants who have not been taught correctly and come from an environment where this is mixed, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, it's mixed, but one has to intellectually and do in practice separate this much more. I think that would be paramount. This would be also paramount, in my view. You stop anti-Semitism also when you allow criticism on Israel. I think that would be the right way to do. Difficult to do, but I think it needs to be done.
I want to thank Christoph Heusgen, Aaron David Miller, for your insights and for sharing your time with us today. I want to thank the audience. I want to thank everybody who's joined us for the live stream, and we will look forward to being back in touch with all of you. I want to thank my colleague, Gail Maddox, whose idea it was to bring together a group on this topic, which was a great idea. And thanks to Georgetown University and Eric Langenbacher and the government department for co-sponsoring this event with us. It's been a great privilege. Thank you very much, and all the best.